There's a difference between being seen and being photographed. It sounds like a small distinction, but for someone who spent 40 years as one of the most photographed human beings on the planet, it was everything. Being seen implies a reciprocity, a mutual acknowledgement between two people, a transaction of recognition that moves in both directions. Being photographed is something else, a capture, a fixing of a moment in time without the subject's participation in what that moment will mean, a taking rather than a giving. John Lennon understood this distinction with unusual precision for someone who had been on the receiving end of cameras since he was 22 years old. He had developed over the decades a specific and carefully maintained relationship with the camera, knowing when to give it what it wanted, knowing when to refuse, knowing how to perform visibility while keeping something invisible. He was extraordinarily good at being photographed. He was also, underneath that skill, someone who found the experience of being captured, truly captured, the image reaching something he had not intended to offer, quietly unbearable. And then in December 1980, a photographer named Annie Leibovitz came to his apartment, and what happened between the camera and the man in the hours before his death produced one of the most famous and most argued about images in the history of 20th century photography. The photograph John Lennon never wanted taken. The one that showed, more completely than anything he had chosen to reveal, exactly who he was. But to understand that image, you have to understand the long and complicated history that preceded it. John Lennon had been in front of cameras from the beginning. The Beatles' rise in the early 1960s coincided with the emergence of a new kind of celebrity photography, more candid, more intimate, more interested in the person behind the public image than in the managed presentation of stardom. The photographers who documented the band in those years, Robert Freeman, who shot the iconic album covers, Astrid Kirchherr, who had photographed them in Hamburg before the world knew who they were artists as much as documentarians, people who understood that the most interesting photographs were taken in the spaces between performances rather than during them. John was, in those early years, a willing and somewhat reckless subject. He was 22, 23, still young enough to believe that his instincts about what to reveal were reliable, still confident enough in his ability to control what a photograph communicated. He gave cameras the version of himself he wanted them to have, the wit, the irreverence, the deliberate provocation that was his primary mode of public engagement. He was very good at this. The photographs from those years show a man who understood the camera and was using it consciously and skillfully as a tool of self-presentation. But something changed as the years progressed and the scale of the scrutiny increased. The Beatlemania photographs, the crowded press conferences, the staged airport arrivals, the constant presence of cameras at the edges of every public moment began to feel less like documentation and more like surveillance. The cameras were not interested in who he was. They were interested in the image of John Lennon, which was a different thing entirely and one over which he had progressively less control. Image had, by the mid-1960s, become autonomous. It existed independently of him, accumulated its own meanings, was reproduced and captioned and interpreted without his participation. He was famous in the way that very few people have ever been famous, and fame at that level does something specific to a person's relationship with their own appearance. It makes the face public property in a way that feels, from the inside, like a permanent, low-level theft. He developed strategies. Not the strategies of a person trying to avoid cameras entirely. That would have been both impossible and, given his continued public life, counterproductive. Rather, the strategies of someone who had learned that the best defense against being captured is to offer something else first. He became a master of the deliberate gesture, the posed spontaneity, the image that appeared candid but was actually precisely controlled. He understood what photographers wanted and learned to give them versions of it that satisfied the professional requirement without surrendering the private self. The wit was part of this. The John Lennon who appeared in photographs from the press conference years, glasses slightly askew, expression half sardonic, always a half-second ahead of whatever the camera expected, was a real person, but he was also a construction. The construction was not dishonest, exactly, it was self-protective in the way that all public-facing personas are self-protective, a selection from the available range of who a person is rather than an invention from scratch. The parts of himself he selected for cameras were real. The parts he withheld were more real still, which was precisely the point. The photographs from the Hamburg years taken by Astrid Kirchherr before the fame had arrived and calcified the image are different from anything that came after. Kirchherr had found them before they were famous, before the poses had been rehearsed, before John had learned that his face was a public object with constituencies and implications. The photographs she made in those years show something that later images only occasionally recovered, a person who has not yet decided what to show. By the late 1960s and through the 1970s, his relationship with photography had become a complex negotiation. The bed-ins with Yoko, those extraordinary theater pieces in which he and Yoko received the world's press from a hotel bed in Montreal and Amsterdam, were among the most sophisticated uses of the camera as a tool of political communication in the 20th century. He was not being photographed. He was directing the photographs. The distinction was absolute. The cameras were present at his invitation on his terms, serving his purposes. What they captured was what he had decided they should capture. Yoko Ono, who was herself a visual artist with a developed understanding of the relationship between object and observer, between the image and the thing it represented, had deepened John's thinking about this. Her conceptual art worked precisely in the space between what is shown and what is withheld, between the image presented and the reality it only partially represents. Living and working with her had given John a more articulate vocabulary for what he had always felt intuitively about being seen. That the camera was never neutral, that every photograph was an argument about what matters, and that the person being photographed had a legitimate interest. Participating in that argument, he was, by 1980, 40 years old and had spent the previous 5 years almost entirely out of public view. The domestic years at the Dakota, the bread baking and the child raising and the deliberate ordinariness that had been his chosen response to the impossibility of the years before, had given him a relationship with privacy that was new in his experience. He had been, for 5 years, largely unphotographed. Not invisible, he walked through New York and was occasionally recognized and occasionally captured by someone with a camera, but not documented in the systematic way that his public life had always involved. The absence of that documentation had been, he discovered, one of the most significant gifts of those years. He had learned what it felt like to exist without being recorded, and having learned it, he was not eager to give it up. The 5 years had also given him something more difficult to name, a settled relationship with his own face, not vanity and not its opposite, something more neutral and more fundamental, the experience of moving through the world without his face being constantly returned to him in photographs and magazine covers and television clips, without the continuous feedback loop of a fame that showed him his own image more often than a mirror. He had in those years simply been a person with a face, rather than a face that happened to contain a person. The distinction is small from the outside and enormous from the inside. He had valued it, and he was returning to public life in 1980 knowing that the return would cost it. When Double Fantasy was released in November 1980, and John re-entered the public conversation after 5 years of silence, the demand for images was immediate and intense. Magazines wanted photographs, newspapers wanted photographs. Rolling Stone, which had maintained a complicated relationship with John across his career, sometimes reverential, sometimes critical, always attentive, wanted photographs for the cover story that would accompany the album's release. The photographer Rolling Stone sent was Annie Leibovitz. She was 30 years old, already one of the most significant portrait photographers working in America, known for an approach to celebrity portraiture that was simultaneously intimate and compositionally rigorous. Images that got close enough to their subjects to capture something real while remaining aesthetically controlled enough to function as art rather than documentation. John had been photographed by many people. He had a finely calibrated sense of which photographers understood something about portraiture beyond its functional requirements and which were simply documenting. He received Leibovitz at the Dakota on the morning of December 8, 1980, with a wariness that was not hostility but was not openness either, the specific guardedness of someone who has learned over decades that the camera extracts a cost even when the photographer is skillful and the intentions are good. The session began with the photographs John was comfortable with, the ones he had implicitly agreed to before Leibovitz arrived. Images with Yoko, images that presented the couple as a unit, that were about the album and the return and the public story he was willing to tell. He was cooperative and professional and gave the camera what he had decided the camera would receive. And then Leibovitz asked for something different. She had seen in the course of the session what any good portrait photographer sees when they are paying full attention: the gap between the person who is being photographed and the person who is present in the room. John was performing not dishonestly, not with any intent to deceive, but in the way that all experienced subjects perform when a camera is present, selecting the version of themselves that they are willing to have fixed in time. Leibovitz was interested in the version that was not being selected. She asked him to lie down on the floor, curled, holding Yoko. He resisted, not dramatically. This was not a confrontation. It was a hesitation, a slight adjustment of posture, the almost involuntary body language of someone who has received a request that touches something they protect. But Leibovitz held the frame. She explained in the way that good portrait photographers explain what she was trying to find, not what she was trying to create. She was not creating anything but what she was trying to find. She was trying to find the person who was present in the room that the camera had not yet reached. John Lennon lay down on the floor. He curled around Yoko in the specific physical way that the photograph captured, his body curved toward her, his face pressed against her cheek, the posture of someone seeking rather than offering contact. The vulnerability in that posture was not performed. It was the actual thing, the man who had been photographed thousands of times revealing, in a gesture rather than an expression, something he had not intended to reveal. Leibovitz shot. The shutter closed. The image existed. John looked at the Polaroid she developed immediately after and said, quietly and with a quality of surprise that people who were present have described consistently, "This is it. This is the one." He left the Dakota a few hours later. He returned that evening and was shot and killed outside the building's entrance. Annie Leibovitz heard the news while she was still in the processing lab, looking at the day's photographs. The image of John curled around Yoko, the one he had recognized in the Polaroid as something true, was the last portrait taken of him while he was alive. The photograph was published in Rolling Stone. It became, rapidly and then permanently, one of the most widely reproduced images in the history of celebrity photography. It was on the cover of magazines across the world. It was in exhibitions. It was reproduced in memorial issues and anniversary retrospectives and books about the history of photography and books about the history of the 1960s and books about John Lennon specifically. It became, in the years and decades after his death, as iconic as the round glasses and the working-class Liverpool accent and the songs that had changed the architecture of popular music. Annie Leibovitz has spoken about the session many times in the years since, and her accounts carry a consistent quality of weight, not the professional pride of a photographer who made a significant image, but something more complicated. She has said that she did not fully understand at the time of the session what she had, that the magnitude of what the Polaroid contained only became clear after the phone call that reached her in the processing lab. That the image she had spent the afternoon working toward had become, in the hours between the shutter closing and the developing, completing something entirely different from what it had been when John was alive to have recognized himself in it. But the argument about the photograph did not end with its publication. Yoko Ono, in the years that followed, spoke about the session with a complexity that resisted easy summary. She had been present. She had witnessed the conversation between John and Leibovitz, the hesitation, the eventual agreement, the moment when John looked at the Polaroid and recognized something. She understood what the image contained, understood it with the precision of a visual artist who had spent her career working in exactly the territory between revelation and withholding. And she was, in different interviews at different times, different things about it, grateful that such an image existed and troubled by the circumstances of its existence, and aware that the question of what John had consented to and what the image had taken beyond that consent was a question that could not be resolved simply. The photograph shows a man who is not performing. That is what makes it so difficult and so enduring, the combination of what it contains and what it cost to contain it. John Lennon spent 40 years learning to control what cameras received from him, building an intricate relationship with visibility that allowed him to remain, in some essential sense, private within the most public life of his generation. And then on the last morning of his life, a photographer found the version of him that the strategies had been protecting, and he recognized it in the Polaroid, and he said, "This is it." Why did he agree? The question has circled the image since it was published. He was experienced enough to know what he was giving. He was intelligent enough to understand what Leibovitz was reaching for. He had said no to cameras before, many times, in many contexts, with the quiet decisiveness of someone who knew the value of what they were declining to offer. The answer, perhaps, is simpler and more human than the question implies. He was 40 years old. He had spent 5 years being largely invisible, and in that invisibility had found something real, had found the person he was when the camera was not present, had lived with that person long enough to trust him, and had arrived in 1980 at a place of sufficient equanimity that the prospect of that person being seen no longer felt like a threat. He had come back to the world with double fantasy, with the music that carried the quality of someone who had made peace with their own complexity. He had agreed to the Rolling Stone session because the album was real and he wanted people to hear it. And when Leibovitz found the frame that reached past the performance, he recognized what she had found because it was the person he had been living with for 5 years in the Dakota. The person who baked bread and raised a child and walked through Central Park and had learned, finally, that being himself was sufficient. He said this is it because it was true, because the photograph showed someone he recognized. Because after 40 years of being photographed, he had finally, on the last morning of everything, been seen.